Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Today we have Sam Bisbee with ThreatStack. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you all very much. So this is going to be a little bit of an interesting one because I'm not actually going to do a product demo. I'm not really talking about our product except in very specific salient ways. But what I want to actually talk to you guys about is what we end up seeing across AWS and other cloud environments, where we see people focusing their time and where we see people having security or compliance issues or just fundamentally risk issues within their organization that they don't really pay off over time. And one of the ways in which we're able to do that, and this is the mini product pitch, you can get the real one over there, is we continuously monitor all of our customer servers in real time, doing intrusion detection both at the host level and what's happening in the Linux kernel, but then also from AWS and their APIs and CloudTrail and so on, and all of that in one platform. And so that gives us a lot of very interesting insights into where people are actually having issues in their environments. But what's actually fun is to bring this back a little bit. Analogies are often helpful, and for some reason I really enjoy NIH studies. So there was a study back in 2011 that found that hand hygiene for healthcare workers reflected attitudes, behaviors, and belief. Basically, how they were able to operationalize it with their hospitals. The most interesting one was a study done in about 1996 in a pediatric ICU in Australia, where they asked people, basically, how often do you actually follow the hand washing protocol so that you don't infect small children with compromised immune systems and so on. And the foreman got a little screwed up here, I apologize, but when they asked all the healthcare workers, how many of you obey it 100% of the time, only 73% of the people said that they actually fully obeyed the hand washing protocol. When they overtly followed them throughout the entire shift and monitored how often they obeyed it, it dropped down to a third. When they covertly observed how often do you follow hand washing, dropped down to 11%. As a CISO, I read this as 73% of the organization say that they follow my InfoSec policy. About a third actually do it if I actually watch them, and I watch the engineers actually put things into production, and then it drops down to about 11% who are actually doing this constantly 100% of the time and doing everything that they should be doing. And it's important to remember that while we have a lot of great practices within our organization, we do security awareness training, we have policies, we have all this great stuff, we have to fundamentally operate from a position of assuming that people are going to do insecure things. Whether that be plug a USB that they found on the ground into a computer, click on a link in an email, provision EBS hard drives without encryption, because it's why not. Whatever that reason is, it's not that they are trying to make your organization less secure or increase risk over time. They're just not caring as much as you do, and they often feel like they're in a room full of knives and guns and you're asking them to pick a weapon, instead of you actually helping them along the way and showing them how to do things better. And if we look for a model, because we need a model to kind of gauge how well we're doing, I actually really like Dan Geer's quote. He's the CISO at In-Q-Tel, which is the investment arm of the US intelligence community. He actually has this great quote, which is, the state of security is the absence of unmitigatable surprise. So if we unpack that a little bit, step one is be surprised less, know what's happening, look around what's out there, and step two is when there is an issue, have that tight feedback loop back into your organization. Putting it into more realistic terms, a good security program or a good security organization, the way that they operate is they come in every day, they identify the top risks, they go put monitoring and detection and visibility around those risks, they work with the rest of the organization to put controls or change that behavior, they put controls in, monitoring in place to understand whether or not that's working over time, then they come back the next day and they go back to step one. A bad security organization doesn't follow anything like this. They write a security policy, they publish it, they threaten people with an HR violation / their job, and then they go home at 5 o'clock. Doesn't really work. But what's interesting is when you take these processes and how people think about security and modeling it, they are actually paying attention to often the wrong things. If you read the New York Times, if you listen to a lot of security vendors, trade publications, whatever, they're talking about, Hollywood-esque nation state cyber crypt, ... Not that none of this stuff is happening, but what's interesting is that's at the top of Maslow's hierarchy. It turns out that most breaches are boring, that it's just people trolling through the AWS IP space or the Azure IP space, whatever, looking for easily vulnerable software that's 10 years known vulnerable. And they're leveraging automation to get into that environment faster. And they're often doing it for reasons that don't necessarily make sense to you. One of the most important things is to remember that for most actors out there, most people who are trying to steal data, spin up rogue infrastructure in your environment, or compromise your payroll system, whatever it is, that's how they put bread and milk on the table. That's their job. They are calculating return on investment. So if it's sufficiently difficult for them, it might not be worth the investment. But they might also be looking for value that you're not looking for. So frequently, for example, we'll see people come in and just try and spin up infrastructure to extend their botnet. Because you could say, look, I have $5 a month on my AWS bill. I'm JoeBobsFishingSupplies.com. Nobody cares about me. If Russia owns me, why do I care? Whatever. I have no IP. And then Joe Bob's Fishing Supplies looks at their AWS bill at the end of the month, and it's got $60K because somebody was running Bitcoin mining infrastructure in their environment. The point here is not that that's going to necessarily happen to you, though it could. The point is more that the objective is fundamentally different. And one thing you often don't hear from people who are talking about APTs and nation-state actors and all this craziness is that what's the actual value that they're trying to extract, because there's not a lot of open discussions about it. Most people don't have crown jewels. Ashley Madison had crown jewels. They got breached. It was pretty obvious what the crown jewels were going to be if they were going to get breached. Most people, it's things like Bitcoin mining, DDoSing, but then there's the fun stuff like ransomware within the AWS environment. You go back to a company called, I believe it was CodeLock or CodeSpaces or something to that effect. They were basically a backup company in the cloud. They ran AWS a couple years ago, and they got breached. Somebody was in their AWS console, took root access of it, and attempted to ransom it to them, basically saying, hey, please pay us money, or we're just going to delete everything. They didn't pay money. They attempted to recover access by logging in through the root account, not realizing that they had created another account in there with privileges. Saw them come in and try to regain control. They deleted every S3 bucket, RDS instance, EBS drive, everything. And the CEO had to go write a letter basically saying, I'm a backup company, we're a startup, we're returning money to investors because we don't have your data anymore, we've lost your trust. Again, extreme example, doesn't always happen, but this is an example where the incentives are fundamentally different and people are thinking about this access differently. One also important thing to remember in there, and there's just a general advisory, your AWS console and APIs are no different than physical data center access. Just because every vendor assessment asks you about your fire suppression system in your data center when you're running in AWS and doesn't ask you about who has access to your AWS console does not mean that you shouldn't be protecting it. So when you do look at the investments and where is all this happening, well, the traditional beliefs in where people are investing, it's in attribution. Attribution is always one of my favorite ones because again, going back to Maslow's hierarchy, most people, even if they were able to do attribution, could not actually leverage it in any way. First of all, attribution is extremely difficult. Basically, everybody's using the same tools out there, but let's wave the magical wand and say attribution is simple. You can exactly figure out the group or the person or whatever that's attacking you. What are you going to do about that? Are you going to call them up and ask them to please stop? Are you going to go and report them to law enforcement because you actually typically have to show actual damages to get the interest, and if there might be jurisdiction issues, et cetera. And also, if you're in a position where you have a hard time even detecting that and you don't have all the tools in place to actually leverage something like attribution, you might also not have the tools and capabilities and processes internally to be able to provide the forensic data to law enforcement that they need. So it doesn't really work out that way. Whereas, you take the things on the left and then you look at the things on the right, there's all that press about people leaving MongoDB and Elasticsearch and whatever database instances directly out on the internet without credentials and people just logged into them, or went in and attempted to lock access and ransom the database to them. Record-setting DDoS attacks. That's not something that my company helps you with, but there are record-setting DDoS attacks out there. Meanwhile, DDoS mitigation is getting easier and easier and cheaper, and can actually be 24/7 inline at times instead of relying on backup sites. So all of this stuff is getting easier, and what's interesting is it's also getting easier for the other side. You look at something like scanning through the AWS IP range to look for known exploitable software. You look at DDoS attacks, you look at all these things. Oftentimes, it's not actors actually doing this themselves. The Hollywood style of fingers on keyboards, that's declining in popularity and commonality. What's increasingly more popular is building a very large botnet and then renting it out to other people who do not have these capabilities. They can rent it per hour and say, I want you to DDoS this domain, these IP addresses, I want you to scan these IP ranges, whatever. So you don't even need to be that sophisticated to be able to extract value. It's also largely all automated, right? Because again, they're trying to leverage the same benefits of automation that you're attempting to benefit in your organization as you DevOps all the things, CI/CD pipeline so that people can push code 100 times a day and break your application, whatever your use case may be. They're leveraging the exact same things and getting the exact same benefits. On the last point of people getting more sophisticated, one of the most fun things is they're also getting more sophisticated about AWS. So for example, we've seen occurrences where somebody comes in with a stolen access key, just like the standard stories you'll hear, realize that they don't have the privileges that they want to take the actions and the objectives that they want. So they spin up a server, access that server, use it to move laterally to the network, scanning the network, finding other systems, compromising those systems, and moving through the EC2 instances until they find one that has the right IAM permissions, and then they move back across the membrane back into the AWS APIs, attempting to either open up security groups, get access to an RDS instance, S3 bucket, whatever. So as the industry is leveling up and getting more sophisticated in how we defend, so are the attackers. Going back to the previous point, most of the crimes are either based on opportunity or persistence. I would argue that more and more and more of them that we're seeing, as far as just frequency, are crimes of opportunity. Where there's high impact for the business, it's much more crimes of persistence. And this is a large part of the problem. Back in the good old days, it was very hard for a very small, unsophisticated shop to spin up complex infrastructure and environments. Now it's easy. You too have the same access to all the compute, all the big data processing, all this fancy stuff, and you can DevOps, you can automate everything. You too can look like what all the big players write about in their blogs and whatever else, and you can feel good about that. That democratization, though, kind of forgot the whole security thing and didn't really bring security along with it. The whole reason for this entire conference is that people started to put brick and mortar back online, or not back online, online for the first time. They focused on reliability, performance, all these things that they realized were now important abilities or disciplines for them in the same way that it used to be important for them when they had a brick and mortar business. So they bought, made sure the lights turn on, all that stuff. And then they forgot that they also bought a security camera and a roll-up gate. So real quickly, in the last minute and a half-ish here, and I'm happy to stick around after and chat with you, I want to run through an actual incident that occurred and how people who had no security background, purely ops background, they happened to use our tool, but it wasn't actually our tool that really drove a lot of this for them. They were actually able to identify a breach and resolve it themselves. So the first clue was this was actually an ops or availability page. They had RabbitMQ backing up in their environment, and things just weren't happening. So they got woken up, and no one was around, so they started to investigate to figure out what's going on. The second clue was that after they deleted this rogue queue that they had never seen before, they started to look around. So they looked for network traffic to the server since this key was created. And here's a horrible screenshot of our product, and you can get a better one over there. But they did a search basically looking for all the RabbitMQ network traffic to that server. And they found it all looked pretty normal for all their workloads, and then they found, wait, we're running old Node.js on these host names that look the same, and then there's some Python running on a server that doesn't look familiar. Let's look at that. The third clue was they went in, they removed the rogue software from their jump host that was actually going and creating these queues and doing all this stuff, but they wanted to see what else had the software been doing. Where did it come from, all that good stuff. So they dove into our process detail page that gives them more forensic detail, and they saw where it started, they saw the network connection that they had from before, and then they also saw that there was a network connection from that process out to another server out on the internet. That doesn't feel great. And then they also figured out that this had only been running in their environment for a couple days, but had been running throughout. For those playing along at home, this is when you go from an incident to a breach. Luckily, they had access to that other environment, and when they accessed it, they got the payoff, which was that an engineer had actually run rogue software in their environment because they didn't like the engineering product process to hit their customer data, exfil it out to another cloud provider, and were playing with it there. And they'd actually spent like all the credits in that other cloud provider's environment. And this was an employee. And this is called a breach. This is not just an incident. This is even more common and even more impactful than the typical types of breaches that you hear about in the news. All the vendors are trying to sell all these really cool whiz-bang systems around, when really, all you're trying to figure out is how you track who did what and when. That's the first part. They didn't even get alerted to this by a security product, but it was a security incident. So I'm out of time. This was very fast, 15 minutes. I'm going to hang out here. We got the booth over there. We've also got pub crawl later on. I will be at that as well if you want to hang out. We're giving away cool hats that you see people with. And I believe that there's a raffle for a Lego set. Thank you all for coming, and I'm sorry this was so short, but happy to talk after.